On solid ground and having escaped the depths of the mountain, Rise beheld the western wilds with no small amount of trepidation and awe. The mighty timbers stretched higher than towers, as though laying siege against the mountain, seeking to overcome the barren summit, if such a thing were possible. The world that enveloped Rise was old and had remained undisturbed by external forces since the dragon had entered the mountain, a sight simultaneously wondrous and terrifying. A sweet, crisp fragrance wafted through the air as a harmonic symphony rose from an unseen choir of fowls issuing their swan song for the evening. No longer was his world gray, void of life. The dazzling beauty of the wilds captivated his inquisitive mind. However, with the return of his senses came chill from the biting winds, fear of the unknown, weariness, and hunger. The tales of this foreign world stirred caution within his heart. Here on the ground, he was immersed in the majesty of this fair land, but his insignificance was intensely evident. Rise's feelings of unease were only exacerbated by the inescapable questions of what strange creatures called this land home, and if they were in proportion to the vegetation. Aside from the elusive fowls, Rise was left totally to his own imagination regarding the occupants of such a wondrous land. The sun was already failing, and soon he would be left to wander in the dark, and unlike the chasm, he knew that there was life in this land. It would serve him to be as proactive as possible, should he wish to avoid run-ins with any of the West's unsavory creatures. Suddenly the chirping, which only seconds earlier he had been reveling in, was vexing to his soul, and the shadows shrouding the green forest became a menace to his mind. Keeping an ever-watchful eye out for even the slightest hints of danger, he determined the safest course of action was to remain close to the mountain and search for nourishment within the shadow of the barren summit. However, within the depths of his mind, he knew it was likely he would be forced to venture from the perceived safety of the mountain. For some time he searched under rock and stone, though he could find nothing to sustain life. The thoughts of cool mountain springs fanned the flames of his thirst. His weariness clung to him like a cloak of lead as he searched the mountain, his mind locked on the prospect of water. The boy was so enwrapped in the blind pursuit of his salvation that he failed to note the sunset, and night embraced the land. The winds picked up, and soon even the pleasant scent of the woodlands was driven from him. After several more frustrating minutes of blind searching, he concluded that there would be scarce chance of him finding food on this side of the mountain. He would indeed be required to journey deeper into the unknown. So, allowing his hunger and thirst to guide his steps, Rise ventured from the mountain's domain. When the moonlight could pierce the lumbering storm clouds of winter and trickle through the sprawling canopy, Rise, out of wariness for his new environment, would halt his search and survey his surroundings from the shadows. As frustrating as it was to travel in the darkness, the boy refused to move while there was light, in the off chance any foe should be lurking. However, this caution proved to be in vain, as nothing appeared to be stirring on this gloom-ridden night. If not for the wind and the sorrowful groans wrenched from the ancient timbers, the silence would have been absolute. Feeling terribly alone and woefully outnumbered at the same time, Rise continued to bumble his way through the dark woods, growing weaker with each passing moment. Even in the ranks of the uncanny forest, the boy found his apprehension muted by his hunger, and fears diminished by his parched lips. His mind wandered through the darkness without him as he struggled to maintain his focus. He could not afford to stop, but he found that he had no strength to continue. However, deep within the recesses of his addled mind, he found the will to march onward, even as he began to lose sight of his goal. Rise only knew he could not stop. However, this state of delirium was not to last. The intrepid boy's senses returned to him as the northerly gales died down for a brief moment. The stillness returned his mind to his body once more as he paused, his instincts keeping him from marching onward and potentially revealing himself to the ominous world hidden among the shadows. Without the sound of the wind to conceal his footsteps, Rise halted and listened intently, hoping that he had remained undiscovered during his mindless meanderings. Initially, silence was all that greeted him, but before the winds picked up once more, his ears were pricked by the faint whisper of a sound, a noise not made by foe or beast, but the half-musical medley of rushing water. Like an arrow from off its string, he bolted in the direction of his reprieve, heedless of the perils that had hampered his movements to this point. He found himself rushing back toward the mountain, when at last he came to the source of the spring. Stunned by the dreamscape before him, Rise drank in yet another marvel of the western wilds. A ribbon of pure mountain water streamed down the slope, uninterrupted till disappearing into a cloud of soft mist. The water carved a pool into the stone, which wound a meandering path through the ground. In an instant, Rise's weariness departed, as though it had never been. He rushed to the water's edge and drank deeply. Never had a draught tasted as good as the spring. Lapping up the water at first, Rise began to cup gulp after gulp in his hands in a frenzied attempt to drink his fill. He only relented once his stomach started to ache, and his lips went numb from the chill. The cold water revitalized the boy, and immediately he began to take note of his surroundings, hoping for some sign of food. Rise observed that unlike the rest of the mountain, which was barren of snow and vegetation alike, there was an abundance of greenery surrounding the pool, and the winding course carved by its overflow. Though nothing edible as far as he could tell, it was difficult to say, but there was something peculiar about the entire setup. On its face, the stream seemed natural, or at least had not been constructed by any means he had seen before. Yet the stream flowed in an intricate manner through the rocks in a way that seemed unnatural. Under the face of the hidden moon, Rise followed the winding path. The depth and direction of the stream constantly changed till the spring became so thin that it sprang into 1,000 rivulets of water on a wide, flat stone as large as the deck of a galleon. The water flowed off the edge of the stone, falling onto an unseen surface below. The cascading water created a soft melody that could barely be heard by the boy over the rambunctious wind as he approached the lips of the fall. Peering over the edge, he spied a large shallow pool spanning the expanse's floor like a sheet of obsidian glass. The hollow was perfectly tranquil, undisturbed save for a large willowy tree growing at the end of the square. Its roots were warped and mangled like writhing serpents as they wound over the ground before disappearing under the water's onyx surface. The great tree's sprawling base was so expansive that its roots formed a small island, dwarfing its own magnificent canopy. Heaving softly in the wind, the tree's branches rustled a chorus with the twinkle of the waterfall. It was these gentle movements that revealed the fruit laden in the tree. His mouth salivated at the prospect of food, and without a moment's hesitation, Rise was trotting across the placid surface of the water, disturbing the ancient court. His excursion across the expanse was so long, he began to grow anxious. However, his caution could not stay his march to the prospect of a full belly. As he reached the lowest branch, lilting gently in the rising winds, Rise reached for one of the strange fruits. Plucking the produce from its stem, Rise studied it anxiously before chomping a bite out of the fleshy pod. The meat of the fruit was juicy and tart, but the aroma was sweet, if faint. Though at this point the subtleties of the tree's bounty were lost on the young thief. As soon as the first bite hit his stomach, the boy was consumed by hunger. He tore into the tree's bounty with an unrelenting ferocity, quickly losing count of how many he had eaten, and only relenting when he felt as if he could burst. Grabbing a hold of the tree's roots, he steadied himself before moving deeper into the bed of roots, water dripping from the soles of his shoes as he climbed out of the shallows. Burrowing deeper into the arms of the tree, Rise found himself growing drowsy. The strain from his adventure in the Barren Summit was finally taking its toll on his body, now that he was contented. He barely had time to nestle himself into the depths of the root's embrace before exhaustion overtook him, and he slipped into a deep sleep. How long he slept, he did not know, but morning was long past when he finally stirred. His mind was full of cobwebs, and he struggled to remember the previous night. But as he shook off slumber's shackles, his senses returned to him. He breathed a sigh of relief as he stretched his lithe body, drawing life into his limbs. He had somehow survived. As dire and bizarre his circumstances, he had managed to escape that accursed mountain, and though he knew much still lay before him, he could not contain his jubilance. Rising, he went to drink from the pool, and plucked his breakfast from the branches of the great tree. Wolfing down the first fruit of the day, he reclined against the trunk. Within the depths of the tree, concealed by its sprawling branches, Rise felt at ease for the first time since the night of the festival. There was an odd tranquility within the branches, as if he had found a small oasis in the tempest. He wished to savor the moment for as long as possible, pushing all troubles and fears from his thoughts. As he shook the weariness from his mind, and he grew more alert, it became increasingly difficult to vanquish his anxieties. He contented himself to capture the moment of tranquility, if only for a moment, though in the end his struggles to postpone his worries only deprived him of his peace of mind. As he ate his fill once more, the battle within Rise bubbled to the forefront of his mind. The gale was nearly upon him already. Once it arrived, winter would be in full swing, and snow would cover the land till spring. Even if the Barren Summit's curse kept the snow from remaining, traveling the mount would be nearly impossible. However, he could not foresee himself surviving long in these wilds. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, there was only one path before him, and that would lead through Mailer. A cold chill ran up his spine as the gales from the winter storm breached his asylum. Gazing into once placid waters, a creeping dread that turned to bitterness and then anger gnawed at his soul. No longer numb from the shock or Ningal's spell, each memory forever etched into his mind visited him. He did not wish to die, especially after all he had been through, but it was not the fear of death that robbed him of his vigor and created the dread within him. His heart was loathed at the prospect of being at the mercy of those foul men. He would rather never escape the pit than to suffer the indignity of being forced back down into the abyss. Even if he managed to survive the mountain and somehow outrace the storm, he knew there was a fair chance he would be spotted before he even reached the bandit village. Yet his gut told him, as bleak as it was, this was his only recourse. As he gathered what meager supplies he could carry, his mind wandered to the events of the last few days. He had cheated death a number of times, and he could not help but feel his luck was about to run out. Thinking back to the dragon's words, the boy coughed a humorless chuckle. Why couldn't Ningal have decreed, "Whenever you will be hungry, you will find food," or something of the like? Though perhaps food was not the appropriate example now. Perhaps the serpent's blessing would still prove itself useful. Surely the creature had not toyed with him. Sunlight finally crested the peak of the mountain and streamed through the green canopy that sheltered him. There was no time left to lose. He had the strange fruit packed tightly into the deep pockets of his baggy coat, and he had been able to fashion a crude sling for the callus by cutting and weaving supple branches from the tree. At least if he did come to blows with the vermin of Mailer, he would do so armed. Mirthlessly he mused that having been under the mountain and now going over it, he hoped that his next feat would not be to go around it. With nothing left but the journey ahead, Rise embarked on the trek up the mountain. The sky was already overcast by the oncoming storm. It would not be long before the rays of the morning sun struggled to reach him. He counted himself lucky as he surveyed the peak before him. On either side of him the range stretched to the very clouds of heaven. Their peaks were adorned with a perpetual crown of snow and ice. Though not quite so proud, this mount would prove no less a challenge. Rise's eyes pierced through the haze that shrouded the mountain slope and studied the few routes available to him. None were easy, but he did find one that he deemed satisfactory, at least as far as he could see, till the mist completely obscured his vision. Once outside of the haven, he felt exposed to the prying eyes of the western wilds, though the light of day was enough to quell such anxieties, even if it made him easier to spot. Swiftly and discreetly, the boy followed the peculiar stream back to the base of the mount. Before reaching the waterfall, he diverged from the brook, heading south, skirting along the edge of the Barren Summit, before finding the steep beginnings of the path he had elected. Attempting to scale the sharp incline, the boy found he would need to redistribute his possessions to traverse the more rigorous elements of his journey. Eventually he was able to strike a suitable balance that would not interfere with his ability to climb, and he was prepared to navigate his course. Pathfinding proved tricky. Operating on educated guesses, he tended to follow the path of least resistance. Locating Mailer was his top priority. He was lost right now, but if he could reach a height where he could look down on the village, then it would be significantly easier to spot than it had been when Kaysen and he had first arrived. With the storm clouds choking the last few rays of the sun, he wondered if he would be able to spot anything by the time he crested the barren summit. By midday, the winds had driven most of the fog from the mountain, permitting Rise to see much more clearly. In combination with the limited vegetation, he was able to have a firm grasp of the mountain's contours, and avoided the most treacherous routes. As the day wore on, and the temperature continued to fall, Rise began to deliberately take paths that shielded him from most of the wind, as the chilling lashes grew in severity and frequency. This often meant that his movements were lateral instead of vertical, so progress slowed. He found himself reaching for his provisions more often than he would like, in an attempt to keep his body temperature up. As night encroached upon the mountain ridge, the temperature continued to plummet. By the boy's best estimate, he still had several hours yet to travel on this side of the slope. If he could crest the ridge before the last light, his odds of finding Mailer would increase dramatically. Hopefully he could still make it in time. With a renewed sense of urgency, Rise pressed on, beyond the evening and into dusk. Chilled to the bone, with the evening sun at his back, Rise braved the whipping wind in a desperate heave up the mount. Revealing himself to the gale and its cutting winds, he barreled his way along the winding path with the utmost haste. On all fours the boy scampered up the side of the mountain, keeping low to the ground till he could round the southern face of the barren summit. He noted that unlike when his uncle and he scaled the mount, that the stones were cool to the touch, though the lingering odor remained. The thought occurred to him that the curse of the barren summit could have been related to Ningal Suin's imprisonment. He was uneducated on matters such as curses, but it stood to reason that they could be linked. If this suspicion did prove true, then the snow would take root on the mountain. The passage narrowed, and Rice began to fear it would close entirely. Soon he found himself towing a narrow ridge along the face of the summit. The young thief had never been afraid of heights, but now he was trembling uncontrollably as he clung to the cold stone, thousands of hands above the next tier of the mountain. So engrossed was he with his predicament that when he looked out to see what lay ahead of him, his breath caught in his throat as he was stunned to see his homeland once more. In the last rays of the autumn sun, the boy surveyed the splendor of the heartlands from his perch atop the mount. His eyes roamed across the rolling hills dotted with the Nairu trees, whose golden leaves still clung to their branches. From the shadow of the mountain ridge flowed the headwaters of the rivers that nurtured Arden and its people. Eagerly Rise shuffled forward, heedless of the peril. He did not stop till his eyes were greeted by the sight that would stay with him for as long as he lived. Glistening like great diamonds beset in the earth, the boy was captivated by the fiery visage of the great lake, Hawa, resting atop a vast plateau of the same name. He had heard stories of such lakes, bound high above the earth, in great goblets of stone, and had hoped to visit one before returning to Hydria. The greatest, such as Hawa, were considered holy by the state and jealously guarded. From this vantage it was easy to see why they were deemed so precious. Rice forced himself away from the magnificent spectacle as he recalled what was at stake. The world was graying with each passing moment, and soon a starless night would consume the mountain ridge in utter darkness. He had to find Malor, or else he would be forced to navigate the treacherous paths blindly, with little hope of finding shelter from the tempest. The ridge on which he stood expanded before taking a steep drop. Below there were several paths available to him, though none would be easily navigated. Beyond his present position he could see little. The shadows concealed much from Rise's eyes. With the last embers of day, he scanned the mountain for plumes of smoke, only to be left disappointed. The winds were too strong, and the shadows too long. The light having faded into the west, and with nothing but the road ahead, Rise trudged on disheartened. He could no longer plan out his routes, and now he had to rely on memory. Progress was slow and grueling in the inky twilight, as unforeseen obstacles threatened to derail his journey. He found himself skating along increasingly narrow ledges, blindly hoping that he would find stable ground. On more than one occasion, he had saved himself from a nasty tumble by mere fingertips. At first, the thrill of these moments served to invigorate his senses, but with each passing danger, his position grew more and more dire. His legs were becoming shaky, and the exertion left him drained once the immediate danger left. The walls were much steeper on the eastern front, and though the mountain ridge shielded him from the brunt of the gale, the storm was painfully close. When he was able to find suitable perches, Rise would dip into his dwindling provisions in a vain attempt to help his body fight off winter's bitter sting. The mild warming effects of the fruit were short-lived, and he was finding fewer opportunities to consume them. The road was totally unpredictable now, and he had lost what little sense of direction he had possessed. If the path to Malor continued to elude him, then he would be forced to stop for the night. However, with no fuel to start a fire, that would mean certain death. Once again, the path narrowed and steepened. Exhausted, cold, and being tossed about by the icy gales, Rise could do little more than crawl forward. The stones were loose, and his grip was weakening. Yet the terrain grew more perilous still. As if to add to the boy's woes, his chapped cheeks were struck by something. He could not wipe the object away, as his numb fingers clung to the path with all of his might. But he knew well what had lighted on him. The herald of winter had arrived at last. The storm, in all its fury, had reached the Barren Summit.